Jesus Christ, it is so humid in here. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I am talking about album number 6 from M83, Hurry Up, We're Dreaming. Okay, it's finally time for the big one. M83's most commercially successful album to date by far, the album that saw their big mainstream breakthrough featuring their only single to hit the Billboard Hot 100 in the US, Midnight City. Chances are, if you've only heard of one M83 album, it's going to be this one, and if you've only heard one M83 song, it's most likely that song. This album absolutely blew up in a way that no other M83 album ever did before or since. Now, I don't think Anthony Gonzalez and company were really going into this project expecting that kind of greater level of success. There weren't any major lineup changes behind the scenes, although it is definitely drifting back towards Gonzalez helming and directing everything rather than the marginally more balanced band effort that their last album, Saturdays Equals Youth, was. The new singer from that album, Morgan Kibbe, was still technically on board for this one as well, though with a significantly diminished role compared to how much he contributed to the last one. As far as I can tell, her presence here ends at a spoken monologue on the track Reunion. Also some backup vocals on the intro, some lyric writing, and presumably still playing keyboards and performing in live shows and stuff. But that's it. The biggest change behind the scenes was probably the new producer, Justin Meldal Johnson, a bigger and more recognizable name than any of the other producers that worked with M83 in the past. Meldal Johnson had also worked with the likes of Beck, Nine Inch Nails, Serge Gainsbourg, Pink, also after this Paramore, Tegan and Sara, Young the Giant, Neon Trees, and of course most relevant to me, Air. He had a lot of integral contributions to their 10,000 Hertz Legend album, which still remains an all-time favorite of mine to this day. And he was a driving force behind this album to the point where he may as well have been an unofficial new member of the band, even sticking on as a producer and studio performer for M83 on their next two albums as well. Got some thunder in the background there. Very, very frightening. Now, sonically, this album on the surface is kind of a continuation of the 80s synth-pop revivalism streak that M83 started with Saturdays Equals Youth, and about equal parts electronic and rock. But there was also something different about the sound of this one to set itself apart from their last album, too. When I hear Saturdays Equals Youth, I think that could easily pass as an album that actually came out in the later 1980s. It feels like a giant love letter to that entire decade and to the new wave scene in particular, trying to recapture the sound of that era as faithfully as possible. Hurry Up We're Dreaming also takes lots of influence from 80s synth-pop and new wave, but it's executed in a very different kind of way that makes it feel not like a direct pastiche of sounds of the past, but more like a contemporary spin on them. One that put them closer to the other indie rock and pop bands that were scoring big one-off charting hits every now and then around that time. Your One Republics, your Godies and Funds, your Bastilles, your early Imagine Dragons back when they were listenable. But M83 also managed to blow up to just that right level where they never became super ubiquitous to the public at large. People still occasionally call this band underground, which feels slightly ridiculous to me, but at least kind of makes sense from a certain perspective. And they lost none of their previous cred in the process either. In fact, with their more electronic background and putting out an album like this, I would argue was what really set into motion the wave of indie-inspired EDM acts to break out later in the decade. People like Porter Robinson and Madeon and all those feel like they often wear their M83 influence on their sleeve and may have been directly inspired by this album to go in the direction they did for their own debuts. Now, of course, none of this was to say everyone was happy with the way M83 ended up going on this album. If you're one of those people who thinks this project is super overrated, then you are absolutely not alone. I mean, people like Anthony Fantano blasted it back in the day. There were a handful of predictable sellout cries from the older diehards who'd first gotten on board for older albums like Dead Cities or Before the Dawn Heals Us. For what it's worth, I do think there are plenty of valid reasons to flat out dislike this album, and I hardly think it's perfect myself. But of course, if you were looking for a video ranting about this album's failures, you sure as hell aren't going to get that here. This has always been my personal favorite M83 album, and it's never been particularly close either. It wasn't the first M83 album I ever heard. There was a failed attempt to sit through their whole catalog a few years before Junk release that got me acquainted with their earlier work. But this was the album that first inspired me to try and get into them in the first place. I'd seen it regularly holding high spots on the iTunes electronic charts and had been intrigued by the concept behind it. This is, of course, a double album. It has 22 tracks split over 2 discs, which are meant to act as a brother and sister album that mirror each other. structure which I totally didn't wholesale rip off for one of my own albums from 2016. Although as far as double albums go, Hurry Up We're Dreaming isn't as much of a commitment as you'd expect. It's only 73 minutes total, technically enough to fit on one CD. And the two halves of the album are fundamentally similar enough where you could theoretically just let both halves play out back to back and not even notice when the second half started at all. One could easily say that this structuring leads to an album that has way too much filler with too many cuts that feel underdeveloped, and certainly the bombastic and stadium-friendly sound of this project has the danger of getting overbearing at this length. I think that's a valid complaint. Even I myself think the album's hits the best if I take a short break at the halfway point rather than going through the whole thing in one unbroken sitting, even though it can also work in one unbroken sitting. Another complaint one could theoretically throw at this album is the lead vocal presence of Gonzalez himself, which appears to be maybe a bit controversial with people. Gonzalez obviously did lead vocals on most of the previous M83 albums, but he would usually stick to a very restrained delivery that bordered on mumbling, and never really put himself in the focus. Save for maybe some moments on Before the Dawn Heals Us where he breaks into a slightly ridiculous falsetto. This album has moments where his voice is in either of those modes, but it mostly shows him in between those two extremes with this much yelpier, higher mid-range delivery. I can see how he would grate on some people's nerves, but I don't think any of his vocals ever reflect embarrassingly upon him or get in the way. He sounds more confident behind the mic than he did on any previous album, and even the brief moments of falsetto here aren't even close to as grating as they were on Before the Dawn Heals Us. They go over surprisingly well on tracks like OK Pal or Steve McQueen or all those. One could also complain about the vagueness of the lyrics and the disconnected subject matter that doesn't seem to add up to anything especially meaningful, though I would argue that M83's lyrics have always been like that. I never felt the need to really go into them in my previous reviews in this series, since they were just meant to provide disconnected, somewhat profound-sounding imagery, and this one's no different. But maybe that's even a bit more fitting given this album's theming around dreams and how they so often don't make logical sense or connect to each other if you think about them while you're awake. But they still feel like they flow naturally and make perfect sense while you're asleep. That also seems to apply to the flow of the album itself as well, which many have described as a bit disjointed and certainly switches its style around quite a bit, but I feel is somewhat necessary for the length and amount of tracks this album has to feel properly justified. For an experience this big, and you need plenty of sonic variety, and M83 absolutely deliver that, while obviously getting every track to fit into the same overall sound and make it feel like it all belongs together. In terms of individual tracks, I will first have to note that, even though I think this album is really dang consistent across the board quality-wise, I do find the first half of the album to be markedly stronger. Disc 2 is great too, but Disc 1 doesn't have a single weak point. Right off the bat, it starts with, of course, a track called Intro, and, you know, on most albums a track called Intro would be like 30 seconds of building ambience or something, but here the intro is a fully fleshed out grand mission statement for the entire project, starting out with slow building ambience, but then piling on bright 80s keyboard lines, vocoded whispering, drum rolls, the very first line of Gonzalez's yelping, "Carry on! Carry on!" And even trading off lines with Zola Jesus, who is unsurprisingly a much better singer, but they also don't sound that different from each other on this thing. Oh yeah, and of course the full orchestra and choir building up behind them with further banging drums and glittering bells for extra texture, paying off in the most grand and epic way, and finally dying out with some stray guitar distortion at the end. That's one heck of a way to get people's attention right off the bat. Even if I guess you could say it was a more synth-driven companion to what he did on Moonchild on Before the Dawn Heals Us, this might end up as the stronger or more impressive cut. I might mark it as the best opener on any M83 album. Either that or Moonchild or Hellriders on DSV2. I don't know. But anyway, that's immediately followed by the big single we all know, Midnight City. This track wasn't love at first listen. Its hook of all the high-pitched vocal chops going over all these blocky synths and switching off between this sound and really simple and stripped-back 80s beats and synths with Gonzalez's mumbled vocals. It wasn't the kind of thing that might have grabbed my attention in a vacuum. But after all these years of growing on me and basically having become the signature M83 track, I can't complain about any of it. The walls of synths are super epic, the sound of everything is immediately catchy and memorable in such a way that can just easily pop into my mind whenever I think about this band in passing. Oh, and of course we can't forget that fantastic sax solo at the end. That little cherry on top that turns a great song into one of the all-time greats in their catalog. And it only goes upwards from there. That single is immediately topped by Reunion, which, holy crap, this track is something else. I grew up with a fair bit of U2 playing around the house, and this track has a similar kind of appeal to me as like their big Joshua Tree and Unforgettable Fire type material, with all these dense layers of guitars and fast-paced drums. I mean, Gonzalez may not have as much control over his voice as Bono, but his whoa whoa chorus still works really well in the same way too. He's certainly a lot more earnest than Bono and not trying as hard to command your attention. When he howls over the chorus and the drums kick in, it's just such an incredible rush. I can't help but headbang. Call it a millennial pop cliche, but a track like this is part of why it became a cliche in the first place. Oh yeah, and there's also the monologue from Morgan Kibbe, which I'll admit does feel a tiny bit disappointing for this to be her only lead vocal contribution after her fantastic performances on the last album, but it's still a nice touch for her to be there, and her vague musing certainly fit well with the overall tone of the project. Anyway, that transitions into the first of the ambient interludes, which, by the way, I feel like these are just as integral a part of what makes this album resonate so strongly with me as any of the big singles. There's 3 on each disc, being placed at spots 4, 7, and 10 on their respective halves. And they may be very simple, like this cut where the boats go is nothing more than a few walls of building and bubbling ambient synths that would have fit seamlessly among the track listing of Digital Shades Volume 1, paying off into a quick bit of minimal pianos. But cuts like these really help add that extra sense of variety and flavor to the project as a whole, and I'd still mark most of them among my favorite cuts on the album as a whole. Including this one, just a very nice subtle breather moment that acts as a nice prelude to the following track, Wait, a much slower, quieter, and more intimate ballad, at first nothing but Gonzalez half-whispering over some light acoustic guitars, building up and down, and being joined by some warm Alan Parsons Project-style orchestral sections and Pink Floyd-style drumming. It's a very touching and emotionally resonant moment for the album, and of course his yelping of "No time" makes for a solidly memorable hook. I am sorry for that. And this cut, such a traditional straightforward ballad, is followed by the weirdest cut on the album, Racontez-moi une histoire? I should have looked that up, I'm not French. Which features lots of layers of blipping and jumping synths and a lengthy monologue from Justin Meldal Johnson's daughter, talking about some magical frog that will change your entire life if you touch it. Red becomes blue, your mommy becomes your daddy, everything looks like a giant cupcake, you'll eventually turn into a frog yourself. In a good way, I guess. Now this is the kind of idea that could easily become really annoying. Monologues from little kids like this on albums tend to sound really ham-fisted and contrived, but everything about this story and how it's delivered sounds exactly like the kind of thing a 5-year-old would come up with. It does sound really natural being delivered by a little kid, and there's just something so pure and innocent about it that keeps me invested and even prevents it from wearing out on me with repeat listens, as many of this kind of track tend to. And of course the well-detailed, expansive synth instrumental underneath her certainly doesn't hurt either. It's suffocatingly cute, but in a fully likable way. After an interlude of spacey, cavernous synth organ arpeggios and train sound effects and Train to Pluton, we then get Claudia Lewis, one of the grooviest cuts in the bunch, which features all this really nice Seinfeld slap bass and clapping 80s percussion going over the usual epic walls of synths, and Gonzalez hitting as high notes as he can in that doo-doo-doo chorus without sounding as ridiculously strained as he did on Can't Stop years before. And there's that nice little drum breakdown with the synth solo going over it as a extra nice touch. Fantastic stuff all around, and that track is contrasted with this bright flash, which fittingly feels like a gigantic burst of energy. Lots of crashing acoustic drums, walls of synth and choirs. Just a brief moment where the album decides to go as all out and intense as it can. And that track is contrasted with one more ambient interlude in When Will You Come Home? Nothing but quiet synths and recorders playing very tranquil, high-pitched notes. Tranquil, high-pitched notes and cloudy major key chords. Finally paying off in this disc's closer, Soon My Friend. One more longing acoustic guitar ballad that gets really spacious and gets really grand and epic with all the movie soundtrack orchestras. It sounds like the ending of a movie and like a warm goodbye to all the feelings that have passed throughout this entire project so far. Although, of course, while this would be an excellent album closer in its own right, this is obviously only the halfway point to the album. Disc 1, as a self-contained album, would feel like it just completely outclasses everything M83 had ever done up to that point. It's catchy, it's epic, it's emotional, it's fun, it's well varied, it's well paced, it's breezy, but it's expansive. I have pretty much nothing to complain about for this entire first half. Disc 2 is admittedly not quite as strong. The fact that it has to act as a direct mirror for Disc 1 means you'll be running into a lot of similar moments and ideas that can feel a little redundant when the first half did them better. But again, this half is still great in its own right, and it does justify its existence in context. Disc 2 starts on a similar note to how Disc 1 ended, a very low-key ballad where Gonzalez does his usual impassioned yelping over an ambient synth backdrop and leading to a grand orchestral payoff with crashing acoustic drums and buzzing guitars. Certainly makes for an epic and emotional way to start things out. Then we get New Map and OK Pal as the mirrored companions to Midnight City and Reunion, although their energy levels are flipped from their respective spots on the album. New Map is the much faster paced and breezier cut with all the 80s guitars and keyboards and airy background vocals carrying the same energy as Reunion, although topped out with this really nice sax flute duet at the end, which really seals the deal in the same way as the Midnight City sax solo did. I'll admit it did take me a few listens to even notice the saxophone on this track at all. It's played a lot more slowly like a backing section instead of like an actual solo. The flutes are doing more of the soloing, I guess. But whatever, still really freaking nice. And OK Pal is kind of like a companion to Midnight City that isn't as good, featuring a monologue from Chelsea Aiden to mirror Morgan Kibbe's monologue on Reunion. There's some mildly cheesy keyboard licks and wordless falsetto voice hooks that do still allow the track to slap as suitably well as it could, although I wouldn't say it's a major standout in the grander scheme of the album. Another Way From You is the mirror to Where the Boats Go, has some nice thick Vangelis style build-ups, but I kind of forget this one's there, and it's probably my least favorite of the interludes. It just kind of sounds like Where the Boats Go again. But next we get the mirror to Wait, which is Splendor, one of the few moments from the second half that pretty handily beats out its mirror on the first half. An extremely low-key piano ballad featuring a nasally vocal performance from Brad Lehner, that makes the whole thing sound like some old 70s singer-songwriter cut, and eventually being joined by all these expansive choirs and light bubbly synth arpeggios, like a even better version of their track Safe from Before the Dawn Heals Us. Like, this may not remotely be a subtle album, but a moment like this that is able to lean so much on its subtlety is very much needed, especially after so many cuts in a row trying to be big and loud and epic. Both an effective breather and one of the biggest emotional high points in an album chock full of big emotional high points. The mirror to Racontez-moi une histoire is Year 1 UFO, which is not nearly as strange and doesn't have any little kid monologue, but features a lot of layers of guitars which carry a similar kind of bubbly, cheery energy to the synths on its mirror track, and again have like a bit of more of like a jangly 70s kind of sound to them. At least until the end of the track, where all the guitars abruptly get a lot more distorted and the drums go a lot harder, with a whole bunch of creaky, distorted guitar feedback at the end, perhaps as a brief callback to the band's roots in the days when Nicholas Fromegow was still on board. Fountains is another peaceful and pleasant ambient synth interlude with lots of field recordings of birds and crickets that, when combined together, feel like it exists in this weird subspace that is both day and night at the same time. At least when I actually sat up and paid attention to it. This track could pass me by without noticing it sometimes. And then we get the mirror to Claudia Lewis, Steve McQueen, another one of this album's biggest and most recognizable singles. Which, gonna be honest, never really stuck out that much to me in the greater context of the album. I mean, it's still solid. It's heavy and explosive. It's got some catchy falsetto vocal melodies, light 80s keyboards, and pads of distorted guitars. But at this point in the album, it sounds like so many other different moments I've already heard without as much distinct to set itself apart from the OK Pals and New Maps. Maybe it'd stick with me more if it had been placed earlier on in the album, but I don't know. I don't want to shift anything around on this album either. Still a good track. But, yeah, anyway, next up we got Echoes of Mine, which is even heavier and more epic than the track it immediately follows, like a big burst of energy to mirror This Bright Flash, but obviously a lot more of a slow burn, featuring a French-spoken monologue from an old woman having visions of going into a forest from her childhood or something, maybe acting as a metaphor for passing on to the next life. Another pretty powerful moment, even if I don't know if I'd mark it as a favorite. But then we get Klaus I Love You, my personal favorite of the ambient interludes. Easily the most textured and detailed one, with all these bright and flashy synth cores and reverb-coated vocal wailing in the background, even bringing in a foot-tapping 80s beat partway through. I always used to think that the title was meant to be a tribute to Klaus Schulze, given the stylistic parallels, but actually it's a tribute to Gonzalez's favorite actor, Klaus Kinski, who passed away in the early 90s. Sure, I guess that works too. But finally, that takes us to the album's grand finale, simply titled Outro. And just as intro was a big, well-fleshed-out opening to the whole album, outro matches its scope with subtle builds of ambience building into the grandest orchestral buildups of all, vague lyrics about feeling like you're the king of the world, more slow-burn Pink Floyd drumming, walls of synth and guitar riffs, rising to the most triumphant feeling of having conquered all your inner demons, and finally closing with one last piano passage at the very end. Goddamn, there's a closer that still leaves a big impact even after so many other tracks also trying to leave a big impact. So, that's everything on Hurry Up We're Dreaming. It's unsurprisingly a lot to take in, and once again, it's absolutely the kind of album where I understand any of the people who say it's really overrated. Like, I mean, I've seen fans of this album in iTunes reviews making ridiculous claims like this is the electronic equivalent to The Dark Side of the Moon, which... No? What the fuck are you talking about? I mean, I have made several surface-level Pink Floyd comparisons with some tracks on this thing, and if I had to describe this album using only Pink Floyd parallels, I'd say this is more like if Momentary Lapse had the scope and ambition of The Wall. But, come on, this has next to nothing in common with Dark Side. You're just saying album good without having any decent reference points to actually compare it to. My point is, this album already gets hyped up a shit ton, and I would get it if you heard it and thought it was all a bit overblown. The hype or the listening experience itself. Again, I don't think it's perfect myself. It was not love on first listen, and honestly, before I had started writing this review, I wasn't even expecting to score this thing in the 9 range. I have definitely had listens in the past where it all got to be a bit too overbearing, and the sound would wear out on me near the end. Or there was even some times where I felt like Gonzalez could have done even more with the concept than he actually did, gotten the two discs to contrast with each other more instead of feeling like two reconstructions of the exact same ideas. It's definitely not the smartest or deepest of listens, especially if you happen to really care about lyrics. There was a part of me who wished there was more of a coherent story at one point, but even though there's nothing like that here. Again, the lyrics are just a lot of disconnected abstract imagery that are more meant to sound cool or evoke vague feelings rather than paint a more specific portrait. But again, I think you could level the exact same complaint about all the M83 albums, and I do think it fits for the subject matter of this album being about dreams, which themselves are just abstract imagery that don't make logical sense, and they still do well to capture the usual M83 themes of childlike wonder, nostalgia, reconnection with your youth, all captured in as genuine and earnest a way as possible. It is pouring out wow. If the grandeur for its own sake is tiring for you, I get it. If the sound of the album, which follows a lot of tropes that would eventually become completely done-to-death millennial pop cliches, if those turn you off, I get that too. I feel like even if you were so bold as to say this thing is fake deep, I mean, I wouldn't agree, but I would understand where you were coming from. It's just that, to me, the depth isn't what it's trying to say, but in the instrumentals and presentation of it all. The concept and how all these musical ideas tie together and work off each other. It's an album that combines electronic and rock, but feels like it has the underlying ethos of the former genre, presented in such a way that can cross over into a much bigger audience, but without feeling like it's compromising its vision for the sake of selling more. I mean, Gonzalez has even gone on record to say that he ran out of budget to pay for some of the orchestral sessions, and that the musicians in the string and brass sections agreed to participate for free anyway, out of just wanting to see the concept fully realized themselves, or even already being M83 fans. Never really knew how to feel about that when I read that, but point is, this was clearly a product of pure passion from everyone involved. This is no commercial sellout. It's a grand culmination of what all the previous M83 albums had already been leading up to all along, and presented in a more ambitious way than anything else the band had done previously, which, given the scale this band had operated on with their previous albums, that should really be saying something. And even completely removed from all the hype, this is unquestionably the album that most cemented me as an M83 fan, and the one I hold the closest to me purely on a personal level. It's the one I've most frequently felt the urge to come back to and spent the most time with, one that's kept revealing new things to me with every time I've put it on. Call it overhyped if you like, call me basic for praising it so much, but to me, this is M83's true masterpiece, my easy favorite out of all their albums, and my favorite album to come out in 2011 overall. I think this deserves every bit of hype that it's gotten, and I'm overall feeling a solid 9 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.